Welcome to this episode of SAM Conversations. Today we'd be speaking with Colonel Anil Bhat. Colonel Bhat is a retired army officer. In the past, he has served as the spokesperson for the Ministry of Defense for the Indian government and the Indian Army. Colonel Bhat is an analyst and a security and strategy expert who has authored numerous articles and has recently published his latest book called China Bloodies Bulletless Borders. We're glad to have you on the show, sir. Sir, let's begin the conversation by talking a little bit about your book. So in the recent past, a lot of experts and former army officials are writing about China, and the China-India issue is becoming a hot button issue. How would you say your book is unique?
My book is unique in that it brings out the aspect of a thing with an adversary who's today again an enemy of enemy status, who wanted us to agree to not fire at each other. That means for 53 years till this book ended, we had indulged in bulletless management of a very long border, a line of disputed border, a line of actual control, against a very complex adversary, enemy, who's devious, doesn't follow any agreements made, keeps trying to grab territory on almost a daily basis, and who's overseen, who's monitored, by a monitored, or governed by the Communist Party of China, which is extremely hegemonic, very hungry for power and land. The book brings out all the complexities, the problems of managing this border for 50 years, and various. The first chapter is one which leads up to the 1965 and 1962 war, the first war we had with China. The second chapter is the operative one, which is on the skirmishes in Sikkim. The third chapter is the state of engagement from 1967 to 2007. And the chapter after that is the one from 2007 to 2017. It's 2007 onwards that PLA's attention shifted to Eastern Ladakh. And 17 is when it was the Doklam, happened, and it was now 50 years since 1967. And then in 18, they had when Mr. Modi was invited to Wuhan by Xi Jinping, nobody imagined that Wuhan would be the place from where the whole world would get contaminated. Because it's from the Wuhan Institute of Virology that the leak occurred. And if you research this matter, extensively, it points to almost a deliberate leak. Because having contaminated the whole world with the pandemic on, China began on its next step of at least making a second aggression on India. So essentially, it deals with this problems of managing such an adversary without firing at each other, and keep shifting goalposts. Doesn't when in 2019, in December, when one first heard of COVID, till then the book was just about managing borders bulletlessly. At that stage, I was very certain that this is the result of experimenting in biological warfare. And I said, this can't end here. So I added 2 more chapters on the Wuhan and Mamallapuram summits and the Wuhan, the Wuhan virus, as I refer to it, with a lot of research done on how and what happened after that. And the last chapter being the Galwan and Kailash range, which again were you can say 3rd and 4th rude shocks for China.
Absolutely. So regardless of the origins of the virus, there has certainly been an increase in sort of aggression from the Chinese side since 2020, since the pandemic started. Before we talk a little bit more about that, let's go back to the issue of bulletless border management between India and China. So my question to you then is that how did this practice come around to be? Could you take us through the evolution, and what was the main rationale behind it from the Chinese side, and what was the rationale behind it for India agreeing to such an agreement in the first place?
See, in 1967, they began by upping the ante. They graduated from small arms firing to heavy artillery, heavy mortars, artillery. And we had to, the brigade commander at Nathula, Sikkim, needed the permission from the defense minister, as good as the prime minister, to respond back with artillery, which eventually came because it went to the desk of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who, as the prime minister, was holding the defense portfolio also. And then the result was that they lost almost 400, which not that they declared that. We lost 88 soldiers. They lost around 400 from all accounts that you can put together. And that was a shock, rude enough for them to now start pressing that let us please not fire at each other. Let's not use force. And this amounted to a few agreements, which were renewed from time to time. Agreements for peace and tranquility. And then that peace and tranquility was shattered like never before on May 2020, 5th May and 9th May 2020. But so far again, it was only with, it was again, ironically, not with bullets, but medieval barbaric weapons, iron rods studded with nails or wrapped with the barbed wire. And but this amounted only to about 100 personnel injured. Around 15th of June, when the very spirit of, not firing, not using force was broken, because when the commanding officer of 16 Bihar asked, why are you, why have you placed all this here? Why are you here? You should be there. That resulted in an attack on them. 20 were killed, including that commanding officer. And that resulted in a very, very swift, you can say, revenge counterattack by Indian personnel, again without firearms, barehanded almost. And we accounted for 100 at least of them. To this day, they admit to only about 4 or 5 being killed there.
That's very interesting, sir. Even before the interview, we were talking about how not using bullets allows China to have this plausible deniability, and them using these medieval weapons gives the army the chance to deny using any sort of those weapons, because of course those aren't registered weapons and those don't have the Chinese army stamp on them. So of course they
Yeah.
can't be traced back. And that's very comparable to Pakistan using insurgents instead of their
Correct.
actual forces, wherever, you know,
Absolutely.
especially when it comes to Kashmir.
Absolutely.
But anyway, sir, so the rationale, which seems to me why China pushed for this bulletless border management system was because they were already on the back foot after 1967. They found themselves in a position where they seem to have overplayed their hand. And they thought that it's best to come to a Pacific agreement, which it seems like it was the best way to go about for China, while they could also slowly try building up their military presence along the line of actual control and try grappling for more territory. So, you know, they could balance the best of both worlds this way. But then what changed in 2020? Because in 2020, we see that not only is there on-ground aggression from China, you elaborated on that quite a bit in your previous response, but there's also aggression from China on other fronts. So in the UNSC, for example, China continuously takes a posture against India's entry. China sort of blocks India's entry into the nuclear supplier group. China openly refuses to condemn internationally known terrorists who have, you know, planned attacks against India.
Absolutely.
All
Yes.
for us. So what happens in 2020 and why is this a significant year?
Well, 2020, I'll say much more may have happened had we not responded the way we did on the night of 15-16 June, and thereafter on what we did on the night of 28-29 August, when in a very swift and very concerted move, we brought, we very swiftly and, you know, quite silently occupied the Kailash range. Much to, it is a great shock. It was a great shock to the Chinese because now it put them in an extremely vulnerable position as far as being targeted by long-range artillery, missiles, etc.
We are at a position of.
Yes, large tracts of Chinese territory, you know, being easily targeted.
Mhm.
And now their very aim became to, you know, in these very painfully long conferences, these co-commander meetings that they had, which went up to 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, was to try and get us off that range, which I'll say we should not have. But then that's we are the army of a democratic country, the armed forces of a democratic country, and we just go by what the you know, government says, and you know, we withdrew from them from there, and that made them bold enough to not withdraw from some other you know, places which they've occupied.
So perhaps a more reciprocal withdrawal was in order, but that didn't really happen.
You see, we want them to go back to the at least the pre 2020 May status, which they haven't.
But then that's again a problem because China refuses to formally recognize any existing boundaries, any existing borders. Even the line of actual control is a very moving border in the sense that if China decides to decides one day that it's going to be territorially aggressive, then the line of actual control changes.
You see, the book also brings out the deviousness of the Chinese, the PLA and the Communist Party in not in keep shifting the goalposts, not making, you know, declaring any claim lines. So that, of course, is even other books have, but essentially there are some aspects which I mentioned, which this book, you know, is, and you can say it is useful to researchers, historians, and even there are some of my friends who read it and who found it very interesting and informative.
Absolutely, sir. I absolutely agree with that, sir. The shifting goalposts and the entire veiled perspective of the Chinese government, since, of course, the structure of governments in India and China are so different. I believe the information about what the motives of the government and the army are more transparent in India and therefore easier to analyze. So coming from there, so while there seems to have been a renewed action in the China-India conflict, both in terms of active conflicts and both in terms of posturing. It seems like business and trade relations are pretty everyday and they are almost back to normal. Not only that, Chinese mobile companies are breaking all sales records in India. The trade between China and India are almost back to pre-COVID levels. So do you think, despite the fact that there is a difference in posturing now, things have really changed vis-a-vis the relationship between the two governments?
See, you have a point when you say that it beats the trade levels. We banned about 60 odd apps and what have you.
Yeah.
After these hostilities in May, June. And there was a great sentiment in the Indian market, like on the festival of Rakhi in India. We had shopkeepers, assuring you that this is not made in China, this Rakhi is not made in China, okay? We've stopped dealing with them. There was a great public sentiment of
boycotting Chinese products.
Boycotting China. And, there are some shopkeepers who one chatted with who said, sir, we don't mind a little, we are not that poor now that we can't stand a little, little less profit. But we don't want to, in very earthy Hindi, they said this, कि उनसे नहीं हम लेन देन करना चाहते. So, despite that, the trade levels, the situation on the ground is not changed. That remains, eyeball to eyeball now. And just imagine, after the book ends towards the end of 2021, but it just touches upon what has happened. Instead of withdrawing from the places which they've occupied, they extended their deployment all along till Arunachal Pradesh. And well, they've asked for trouble, because that involves their requisitioning much of clothing, habitat material. For the Indian Army, you can say having a large number of soldiers of the Indian Army belong to mountainous regions. But as far as these very cold climate areas are concerned of the India-China land of actual control, the Indian soldiers are bearing it stoically, but very effectively.
Absolutely.
I believe the Chinese are having a tough time.
Tougher time.
Particularly so because today's army, PLA, is of younger soldiers and conscripts who are not the old 20-year, 30-year,
Veterans.
contract men.
Absolutely. And as you said, since the Indian soldiers have so much experience in the region and are acclimatized to the region, it is simpler, it's slightly simpler managing the personnel as well, I assume. So, so the argument that you made about, you know, the Indian government banning the apps was that despite the fact that there might not be change in the status quo on ground, there is a change in the public sentiment. Is that right?
Public sentiment, there's absolutely no doubt. Now it's very clear. People now even make Chinese food has been very, popular in India. Now there are lots of jibes about Chinese food.
Anything with the name Chinese in it will start being chastised very soon, regardless of whether or not it comes from China. Absolutely, sir. I'll begin with my last question then. So in the recent past, since the past few years, we've seen that America seems to have a renewed interest in the Indo-Pacific. And a reason for America's renewed interest is the consensus among American experts and security officials, the widespread consensus that China will inevitably be a threat in the next few years.
China will inevitably be
a threat. A threat.
A threat. China is a threat. Please.
China is a threat. All right. So
China is a threat. I'm afraid, we've been the U.S. Army, which we've been, having a lot of interaction with, and we have a great regard for, their professionalism. Unfortunately, with what has happened in Afghanistan, and it's not the army's fault. That's government policy.
It's the government rushing the
if I may say, it's under Mr. Joe Biden. Well, it's not spoken very well at all for the US. And
absolutely.
I know that the US Army is not very happy about the way it was handled.
Absolutely.
But you see, the fact remains that even if we had a Quad going, that Quad has had hardly any military implication, military impact, military content to it, which the Quad has a total potential of being a very, very, very effective counter to the Chinese belligerents in the oceans.
Absolutely.
And with having the Indian Navy, having India as part of that Quad, is it's a great strengthener.
Absolutely, it is a game changer of sorts with access to all the strategic positions in the ocean and so on. Yeah.
But there's been no, and China was rattled enough when India became part of the Quad. But the fact remains that the Quad has so far been very non-military.
Very docile in a sense. So, sir, I'll come to my last question from there.
Yes.
Please finish your thought.
No, I said that this is the time for particularly countries like the United States to, make this Quad a very effective, counter.
Absolutely.
To China.
Absolutely, sir.
And creating an AUKUS, I don't know what it amounts to. Yes. Sorry.
No, sir, I absolutely agree that the strength of the Quad is something that China seems to be rattled by. And that's my final question for you today, sir. On one hand, we see that China seems to be a little rattled by the Quad, and Quad has great potential for countering the Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region. On the other hand, we see that the Chinese Navy is very quickly modernizing itself and overtaking the United States Navy, both in terms of strength and in terms of capabilities. So we see a clear conflict over here. And we also see that China has invested heavily in the String of Pearls projects. So what can we assume China would do now that suddenly its String of Pearls projects is threatened by this big military presence in the form of Quad, to potentially big military presence in the form of Quad?
I think, Akshat, the only consolation that one can draw is that China is, the Communist Party and the PLA specialize in optics. That we're a great army. You see them in, photographs of exercises and parades. They're great. But they got no stomach to actually for fighting. And the consolation that I'm referring to is that Chinese aircraft, Chinese ships, Chinese even weaponry, small arms, are of lower quality than many others. And they may have long assembly lines, but only of quantity, not of quality. That is perhaps just a small consolation. And the other, I'll say, consolation is that they'll be piling up everything, and scaring the world. But what we really need to be very, very, apprehensive and prepare ourselves for is warfare by other means. By any whichever means possible. Propaganda, just one of them. Cyber warfare, another. I don't know what all to, because it's an iron curtain where nothing comes out.
Absolutely.
Very little gets known. And what all they're up to, we don't know.
Can't fathom. And the uncertainty makes it a little scarier.
Yes, yes. Absolutely. But for a country like India, there should be no doubt that we better be well equipped. Let us never be caught like we were in 1962. And we not just be equipped, but also maintain a fair level of political will in dealing with China on terrain or on table.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And with the Quad coming in, the prediction is that China, aware of its capabilities and the quality of its material, is more likely to retreat than aggress, right?
I'm telling you today, if the Quad becomes military and a country like France gets added to it, because France has been exercising with us with every Quad, Quad level exercise that we had, the French Navy. The Quad will be even more lethal.
Absolutely. Absolutely, sir. This brings us to the end of the interview, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Best of luck for the book. I was fortunate to read a few chapters of the book while preparing for the interview. A brilliant read for anyone who's interested in China and India's military relationship. Once again, thank you so much for being on the show, sir, and I'll talk to you very soon again.
Thank you, Akshat. Thank you. Pleasure.